Welcome, everybody. We're going to talk today about guideline I, psychological conditions. It used to be a very dangerous guideline. Any hint of a psychological problem on the part of an applicant or a security clearance holder back in the 50s, 60s, or 70s, and pretty much you were out of a federal job. There was big reforms in 2012 in particular, and the process now is much more favorable for people with mental and behavioral health conditions, and that was done to promote people using those healthcare services. And so we'll talk through how to use those services in a way that makes things good for your security clearance rather than bad. Next slide. A disclaimer: I put this on the beginning of all of my presentations. I'm not speaking for the DNI or the DODIG. I did 5 years of service with the staff of the Director of National Intelligence, did 12 years over on the staff of the Inspector General for the Defense Department. But today's presentation is just Dan Meyer. Next slide. So the overview of Guideline I. Guideline I is one of 4 guidelines that are held to what I call the Fab 4. Guideline G, alcohol consumption. Guideline H, drug and involvement and substance misuse. Guideline I, psychological conditions. And Guideline D, at the beginning, I actually should have said that first, sexual conduct. All 4 of those are about your behavior on things that don't relate to the job. That's why they're clustered together in the adjudicative guidelines. For all 4 of those, if you trigger the guideline, it is very important that you have at your fingertips the evidence you need to clear your name. That includes diagnosis, that includes treatment prescribed by a doctor or a professional, proof of the treatment taken. That's one everybody always flips up on. They don't keep the script, they don't keep records. And then 1, 2, and 3 combine, and if security challenges you, you need to be able to go to a professional and get a review of your evidence for 1, 2, and 3. For the 4th one, which is a letter that says you have a favorable prognosis. You don't have to be cured of anything to hold a security clearance. You just have to show that you're engaged with the healthcare system and you're following the direction given you to by the doctors. So that covers also the structure of SEED 4. We'll talk about it a little bit later. Each of these guidelines, there are 13 of them, fall into different areas that are mapped to counterintelligence cases from the 1980s. The reason why you fill out a question on the SF-86 or the SF-85 or the EQIP is because those questions relate to one of these guidelines, including Guideline I, and all of those guidelines were formed after reviewing all the counterintelligence cases in the 1980s where the KGB ate our lunch. So this is a very mapped out, very careful process. They're not doing a deep dive into your background because they want to know things about you for stupid reasons. They're doing this because in the past, people with these behavioral traits have been traitors, and they want to be able to screen the traitors out without affecting the good working federal employees and contractors and service members. So I talked about the changes in 2012. The big thing to remember is that treatment is no longer a bar to holding a clearance. Unless you have to go for hospitalization, I would try not to trigger that one. Hospitalization will bring a presumption that you may not be fit for the federal workplace. But get it if you have to get it, but just be prepared to explain why you're hospitalized. We've taught a generation now to get help very quickly. So it's easier to get mental and behavioral health now than it was when I was in my 20s. And even colleges and universities promote it on their campuses. But there's a difference between something being available and it being necessary for your good health. And so mental and behavioral health services are not something to address lightly. You go if you need it, but don't go because you're curious. We talked about the 4 categories of documentation. The critical thing with Guideline I is if you have a diagnosis, the only diagnosis that's an absolute bar to a clearance pretty much is schizophrenia. And bipolar, there's some portions of bipolar that border on schizophrenia. That can be a problem too. Everything else is fine. I think most of the federal workforce has general anxiety and some level of depression. Okay. It's just natural. It's a very stressful workplace. So the treatment for that is just fine. You just have to have the diagnosis written down. Find one doctor and stick with one doctor. You don't want multiple diagnoses. Okay. If you start shopping around, they'll think you're trying to avoid a diagnosis, or you'll muddle your security record with so many different diagnoses, it gets hard for security to sort it out. With that diagnosis, you should have the second piece of documentation, the treatment prescribed. If somebody prescribes it, you do it. Security doesn't care about your health, folks. Security wants to know whether you can follow the rules. And if you can't follow your doctor's prescription after the diagnosis, they're going to say that person will not follow my security regulations. It's the same thing with your taxes. It's the same thing with Guideline E and violations of law, rule, or regulation. They don't really care whether you're speeding or not. What they care about is whether you're breaking the speed limit. And does that tell them that you're a perennial rule breaker? And that's the kind of people they try to screen out of the workforce. And then I've talked about some of these practices already. With your healthcare providers, I would tell them up front that you're in a sensitive position or you're interested in applying for one, and try to get your healthcare provider to be disciplined. I've seen healthcare providers switch diagnoses, misdiagnose. I've seen a lot of misdiagnoses. And all of these are very, very difficult for security to sort out. So find somebody you're comfortable with, stay with them, and work through their therapy protocol, and keep all the documentation of the aftercare once the diagnosis has been made. So that covers diagnosis, treatment prescribed, and treatment taken. Then if you get a challenge from security, be ready to find a professional who's not your doc, who can review all your doc's papers and documentation, and then issue out a assessment of you that ends with the magic words, favorable prognosis. Most security professionals have no idea what that means. They're not healthcare professionals, but they know the word favorable prognosis. It's in the regulation. And when Mr. Meyer says you want to have a favorable prognosis, don't come back and get me a good prognosis. Okay. I've been in hearings where there's been a fight between attorneys over the difference between good and favorable. I think they're the same. Department counsel for any of the agencies that want to strip your clearance, they may say otherwise. So if you go with a law firm, if you've got a statement of reasons, the law firm should be able to show you past examples, appropriately redacted, of letters that fit that favorable prognosis requirement. So if you can do the Fab Four, 1, 2, 3, and 4, you should be in good shape anytime a Guideline I issue comes up. Next slide. Not something really to pay a lot of attention to. This is just the breadth of national security law. And I just want to point out to everybody that personal security clearance is one tiny item on the world of national security law. It's not something that agencies deal with across the board every day. It's usually just between the agency counsel and the security office. Next slide. Forms of access. Just want to remind everybody that security clearances right there in the upper part, below SAPs and above suitability. This is all a seamless whole, right? From credentialing, getting a badge, suitability, whether you can work for them, clearance, whether you can have access to classified information, and SAPs being special access programs, which are very tightly controlled. To a security officer, this is a flow. Some people will only get credentials. Some people will only get suitability. Fewer people will get clearances, and even fewer people will get SAPs. And what you want to do is manage your healthcare, manage your behavior in a way that gets you to the point of this triangle that you need to be at to make your career a successful career. Next slide. This is my wheel of guidelines, and just note that Guideline I is over on the right-hand side, where we have the behavioral guidelines. It starts out with allegiance to the United States, flows into foreign influence, foreign preference. Those are about whether you are on our side or on our enemy's side. So A, B, and C are very tough ones, and they are counterintelligence officers are very hawkish on those. Then you get into your behavior with D, E, F, that's financial considerations, G, H, and I. J is a joker like E in the deck. J you get if there's some connection to criminal activity. You don't have to be charged to get a guideline J trigger. K, L, and M are all about how you work in a classified environment. And then you come right around and you're back to the beginning again. And so I is in the behavioral guidelines that I mentioned earlier. Next slide. So we've talked about the regulations. Seed 4 is something everybody should Google and read. I tell my clients to read it every year, the week of your birthday. Don't be a geek and read it on your birthday. You'd be surprised how many federal employees' entire lives are rooted in their security clearance and they've never read this document. You don't need to read your agency's regulations. They're all confusing and poorly written, but the DNI did a great job in the overarching regulation Seed 4. So it's a very important document to stay in touch with. I have a typo in there. It should be guideline I, psychological condition, not sexual conduct. My last presentation was guideline D. So within the structure of Seed 4, the guideline I is broken into the things that trigger I, right? The conditions. And then the part that everybody forgets to look at, if you trigger a condition, the part right below the first part of the regulation are the mitigating conditions. And those are the ones that look to the the FAB 4 that I described earlier, diagnosis, treatment taken, treatment prescribed, and whether you have a favorable prognosis. Next slide. Past cases, I've done quite a few of these for the firm. By and large, clients do really well with general anxiety, depression, if they have been upfront in collecting their evidence, if they've been accurate in their SF-86, not putting down information you don't have to put down, but being forthright with information that you do have to be put down. If you're applying for a position or being reinvestigated, you don't have to put everything up front. Okay, let security ask for what they want to have. So just have the 4 categories of documentation ready. If you have something on your SF-86, it will indicate a guideline I condition. Schizophrenia is a tough one. I've never had a client with schizophrenia get a clearance. It might be possible, but everything I've heard from security officers, it's very difficult. So we've talked about some of these already. The key thing to remember is you want to manage your healthcare in a way that produces documentation that you can bring to security if a question comes up about your behavior. Okay. When you apply for a clearance, the very last documents you sign at the very end are waivers. Not a lot of people realize this, and you will sign a medical waiver, which means the security office can go to your doctor and get your files. Okay. A lot of people get angry at this. I've had employees who've been working for the federal government 15, 20 years, and they didn't realize that when you took a clearance, you opened up the books on things that most people keep guarded very closely. So the key thing is to manage your doctor with an eye to the documentation and just keep it and have it at the ready. Don't be scrambling if you get a request for interrogatories. You want to be able to produce all that documentation within about 15 to 30 days. And I've covered the rest of those. Next slide. Just my reminder, my Seed 3 reporting pitch. If you, for instance, have a situation where you have to report a behavior that is guideline I triggering, this could be hospitalization after a mental health incident. Could be a prescription issue. You take somebody else's drugs for a particular condition that were not prescribed for you. All of these things are things that are required to be self-reported. You need to bring them to security, not when you do your next SF-86. You need to bring it to them within 3 or 4 weeks. It may trigger some questions, but if you do that, you get the points up front for reporting where you've triggered a security concern. There are people out there who take the business decision and they sit on stuff for months and months and months. You're taking a gamble there because other people are required to report on you. This is what people don't realize is that Jimmy to the left in a cubicle and Johnny to the right in a cubicle, both are under the requirement to report on you as well. So if you don't bring your issues forward, they may. And then you end up in a situation where there's adverse derogatory information coming forward about you, and you weren't the one to tip off security for that. There we go. Questions. We must have some questions.
Can ADHD or complex PTSD affect security clearance?
Well, yeah, it can if you don't one get a treatment routine in place. If it affects your behavior in the workplace, if it causes you to do something that triggers a security clearance, so maybe you're not required to report that on your SF-86, but because of your ADHD, you left the skiff open. All right, so now you got a guideline K issue. You left the skiff open, right, and anybody could walk in. Then they bring you in, you start talking, they start talking to you and they ask you, are you on any pharmaceuticals or are you being, seeing a doctor? And then you got to answer the question, even though it's not on the SF-86. And then, oh, well, I have these 2 conditions. And they're going to ask you the next question. Where's the diagnosis? Where's the treatment prescribed? Where's the treatment taken? Okay, you give that to them, there may be nothing else to talk about. Or they may come back and say, well, we need to know more about this. They may ask for your healthcare records. At that point, you go to another doc to get number 4, the favorable assessment. You always want to control the documentation of your condition. And in most cases, with 2 conditions like that, you're going to do fine. We have a lot of suffering employees in the federal workforce. And I mean, like a lot of our veterans who've been through the ringer. And we're not going to exclude them from employment because they were out there humping bullets for the United States for the longest war in the history of the Republic. As long as they're stable and they're under treatment, they're going to do great as federal employees. You just got to have the documentation.
And what were the 4 categories of the security clearance again?
All right. It's not the 4 categories. Oh, you mean the 4 categories of access. Okay. So think of a pyramid. The bottom is credentialing. It's not a security clearance. So credentialing is what the contractor who's not going to stay at the facility gets to go in and adjust the HVAC system, right? They stop at the visitor center, they get their credential, the badge, they get escorted in, they drive in their van, they go, they open up the HVAC system, adjust the fan, whatever they have to do, and then they leave, go to lunch. Everybody has to have a credential to get onto a federal facility. So that's the least intrusive review. Next review up is suitability. Every federal contractor, every federal service member, every federal employee must be deemed suitable. Many of us don't know we went through the review because you got a security clearance and they embed the review in the security clearance. But there are 8 factors to suitability. They're very similar to the security clearance guidelines. That has to be decided before you're allowed in the federal workplace. Then there's a security clearance, next level of access up. And those are determined by your behavior under the 13 guidelines. And then at the top of the access pinnacle are special access programs. I can't tell you how many there are. That's classified. I've only been qualified for a handful in my career. But special access programs are specific and dedicated, and it limits people's access to certain types of information. For the most part, you're not going to see SAP issues in a security clearance review. It goes to a separate officer called a SAPCO.
I don't think there's any more questions. So I want to thank everybody for joining today's webinar, and thank you, Daniel, for presenting. Today's presentation was recorded, and a copy will be sent to all attendees later this week.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Be healthy, everybody.